The morning of my granddaughter's 7th birthday started like any other Saturday, with me carefully wrapping the beautiful princess dress I had spent weeks searching for. I had driven to 3 different malls to find the exact shade of pink she had described to me over the phone, complete with sparkles and a flowing skirt that would make her feel like royalty. As I placed the delicate bow on top of the gift box, I felt that familiar warmth in my chest that comes from knowing you found something perfect for someone you love deeply. I had been looking forward to this day for months. 7 years old seemed like such a milestone, and I wanted everything to be special for my sweet Aria. I had even bought a matching tiara to go with the dress, thinking about how her face would light up when she opened it. These moments with my granddaughter had become the highlights of my life, especially after losing my husband 2 years ago. She was the sunshine that kept me going through those long, quiet evenings. The drive to my son Marcus's house took me through the neighborhood where I used to live before downsizing to my small apartment. I couldn't help but remember all the birthday parties I had thrown for Marcus in that same house, how I would spend days decorating and preparing his favorite foods. Now, at 68 years old, I was the grandmother driving across town with carefully chosen gifts, hoping to see my granddaughter smile. When I pulled into their driveway, I could already hear children's laughter coming from the backyard. The house looked beautiful, decorated with pink and gold balloons that matched perfectly with the theme Aria had told me about. My daughter-in-law, Carmen, had clearly put a lot of effort into the decorations, and I felt grateful that she cared so much about making the day special. I grabbed my purse and the gift bag, checking my appearance one more time in the car mirror before heading to the front door. Marcus answered with a big smile and immediately pulled me into a warm hug. For a moment, everything felt exactly as it should be. My son looked happy. The house smelled like cake and celebration, and I could hear Aria's distinctive giggle floating in from the backyard. These were the moments I treasured most, when our family felt whole and connected, despite all the changes life had brought us. The backyard was transformed into a princess wonderland. Pink streamers hung from every tree branch, and a beautiful castle-shaped bounce house dominated one corner of the yard. About 15 children were running around in various princess costumes, their parents scattered around patio tables covered with pink tablecloths. Everything looked perfect, like something out of a magazine spread about the ideal children's birthday party. Aria spotted me immediately and came running over in her sparkly purple dress, her arms wide open for one of our special hugs. In that moment, holding my granddaughter close and feeling her genuine excitement at seeing me, I felt like the luckiest grandmother in the world. She grabbed my hand and started pulling me toward a group of her friends, eager to introduce me as her grandma, who always brought the best presents. The other parents were friendly enough, making small talk about the weather and complimenting Carmen on how beautifully everything was decorated. I found myself in conversations about school activities and weekend plans, feeling included in this community of families that had formed around our children's friendships. For the first hour, I genuinely enjoyed myself, watching Aria play with her friends and helping where I could with small party tasks. Carmen seemed to be in her element as the perfect hostess, making sure every child had enough cake and that all the activities ran smoothly. She had invited what seemed like half of Aria's class, plus several of her own friends and their families. The guest list was impressive, and I could tell she took pride in throwing elaborate celebrations. I admired her dedication to making these moments special for Aria. As the afternoon progressed, I noticed some of the other grandparents had arrived for the gift opening ceremony. There was Grandma Betty, whose grandson was in Aria's class, and Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, whose granddaughter lived just down the street. We naturally gravitated toward each other, sharing that special bond that comes from watching your children become parents themselves. The gift table was impressive, piled high with beautifully wrapped packages in every shade of pink imaginable. I placed my carefully chosen present among them, feeling confident that Aria would love the princess dress I had selected. Some of the other gifts were clearly expensive, with elaborate bows and designer gift bags that probably cost more than some people spend on the actual presents inside. When it came time for the gift opening, all the children gathered in a circle on the grass, while the adults formed a larger circle around them. Carmen had set up a special chair decorated with ribbons for Aria to sit in while she opened each present. The whole scene looked like something you'd see in a family movie, with everyone smiling and cameras flashing to capture each moment. Aria opened gift after gift, each one bringing squeals of delight from her and the other children. There were dolls and games, art supplies and dress-up clothes, books and puzzles, and toys I couldn't even identify. With each present, she would hold it up for everyone to see and give the gift giver a big thank you hug. The joy on her face was absolutely radiant, and I felt my heart swelling with happiness watching her experience such pure delight. My present was somewhere in the middle of the pile, and when Aria finally reached it, I felt that familiar flutter of anticipation. Would she love it as much as I hoped? Would it fit properly? Had I chosen the right style? These were the thoughts running through my mind as she carefully unwrapped the box, taking her time with the ribbon, just as I had taught her. When she opened the box and saw the princess dress, her face absolutely lit up. She held it up against herself, and several of the other little girls gasped in admiration at the sparkles catching the sunlight. For a perfect moment, everything was exactly as I had imagined it would be. Aria gave me one of her special hugs and whispered in my ear that it was the most beautiful dress she had ever seen. But then, Carmen stepped forward with something in her hands, and the atmosphere suddenly shifted in a way I couldn't quite identify at first. She was holding what appeared to be a small gift bag. Nothing fancy or elaborate, like the other presents. Her smile seemed different somehow, less warm than it had been earlier in the day. She walked over to where I was sitting and handed me the small bag with a gesture that seemed almost theatrical. The conversations around us grew quieter, and I noticed several people turning to watch what was happening. There was something about the way she presented it that felt performative, like she was putting on a show for the other guests. Inside the bag was a hairbrush. Not just any hairbrush, but one that was clearly used and had seen better days. The bristles were bent and missing in several places. The handle was scratched and worn, and there were still strands of someone else's hair caught in it. It was the kind of thing you might find at the bottom of a drawer or in a bathroom cabinet that hadn't been cleaned out in years. The moment felt surreal, like I was watching it happen to someone else rather than experiencing it myself. I stared at the hairbrush, trying to process what was happening and why Carmen would give me something like this at her daughter's birthday party. The silence around us grew more pronounced as other people began to notice what I was holding. Then Carmen spoke, and her words cut through me like a blade. Her voice was loud enough for everyone in our immediate vicinity to hear clearly, and there was something in her tone that made it obvious this was intentional. She wanted an audience for what she was about to say, and she had certainly gotten one. The laughter that followed her words was like a physical blow. Not everyone laughed, but enough people did that the sound seemed to echo around the backyard. Some of the laughter was uncomfortable, the kind that happens when people don't know how to react to something cruel. But some of it was genuine amusement, as if what Carmen had said was actually funny rather than devastating. I sat there, holding that broken, used hairbrush, feeling the weight of every eye that was now focused on me. The children had moved on to other activities, but the adults were all watching to see how I would respond to this public humiliation. My face felt hot, and my hands started to shake slightly as the full impact of what had just happened began to sink in. The worst part wasn't even the hairbrush itself, though holding that disgusting used thing in my hands made my skin crawl. The worst part was the look of satisfaction on Carmen's face as she watched me try to process what had just happened. She stood there with her arms crossed, that fake smile still plastered on her face, waiting to see if I would break down in front of all these people. I forced myself to take a deep breath and managed to say thank you in the steadiest voice I could muster. But inside, I was crumbling. The humiliation burned through my chest like acid, and I could feel tears threatening to spill over. I quickly tucked the hairbrush back into the bag, hoping to make this moment end as quickly as possible. Some of the other grandparents looked genuinely uncomfortable. Mrs. Johnson caught my eye and gave me a sympathetic look that told me she understood exactly how cruel this was. But others seemed to think it was all just harmless fun, part of some joke I wasn't in on. The worst part was watching some of Carmen's friends exchange glances and smirk, clearly enjoying the show. Marcus was across the yard, helping with the bounce house, completely oblivious to what had just happened to his mother. I watched him laughing with some of the other dads, having no idea that his wife had just publicly humiliated me at his daughter's birthday party. Part of me wanted to march over there and tell him exactly what kind of woman he had married, but I couldn't bring myself to cause a scene at Arya's party. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of forced smiles and polite conversation. I stayed because leaving would have meant abandoning Arya on her special day, and I would never do that to her. But every interaction felt strained. Every laugh around me seemed to echo with the memory of that moment. I kept replaying Carmen's words in my head, trying to understand what I had done to deserve such treatment. When it came time to sing Happy Birthday, I stood with everyone else and watched my granddaughter blow out her candles. She looked so happy, so innocent of the cruelty that had just unfolded around her. I managed to join in the song, but my voice felt hollow and distant, like it was coming from someone else entirely. The cake was beautiful, 3 layers covered in pink frosting with edible pearls, and a tiny princess figurine on top. Carmen had clearly spared no expense on the dessert, just like everything else at this party. I accepted a slice and ate it mechanically, tasting nothing but the bitterness that had settled in my mouth since receiving that awful gift. As parents started collecting their children and saying their goodbyes, I found myself helping with the cleanup without really thinking about it. It was automatic, the way I had always helped at family gatherings throughout my life. But every plate I stacked and every cup I threw away felt like I was cleaning up after my own humiliation. Carmen barely acknowledged my help, too busy accepting compliments from other parents about what a wonderful party she had thrown. I heard her telling someone about how much work it had been to coordinate everything, how she had been planning for months to make sure every detail was perfect. The irony wasn't lost on me that she had put so much effort into making the party beautiful, while simultaneously planning to make me feel worthless. When most of the guests had left, I finally approached Marcus to say goodbye. He was in a great mood, talking about what a successful party it had been, and how happy Arya seemed with all her gifts. I almost told him about the hairbrush incident right then, but something held me back. Maybe it was the way he was smiling, or maybe I just wasn't ready to have that conversation in front of the few remaining guests. Arya hugged me goodbye and thanked me again for the beautiful dress. She promised to wear it to school on Monday to show all her friends, and for a moment, her innocent joy almost made the afternoon worth it. Almost. But as I walked to my car, carrying that horrible gift bag with me because I couldn't bear to throw it away in their trash can, the weight of what had happened settled back over me like a heavy blanket. The drive home was one of the longest of my life. I kept the radio off, needing silence to process what had just occurred. How had I become someone worthy of such public mockery? When had I stopped being a valued family member and become someone whose remaining time on earth was a source of entertainment? The questions swirled in my mind without answers. Back in my small apartment, I sat in my favorite chair and stared at that gift bag on my coffee table. The broken hairbrush seemed to mock me even from inside the bag, a physical reminder of how little respect I commanded in my own family. I thought about all the birthdays I had celebrated with Marcus when he was young, all the love and care I had poured into raising him, and wondered how we had gotten to this point. I called my sister Ruth, needing to talk to someone who would understand. Ruth lived 3 states away, but we spoke every few days and had always been each other's closest confidants. When I told her what had happened, the silence on the other end of the line was so long, I thought we had been disconnected. When she finally spoke, her voice was tight with anger. She couldn't believe that anyone would treat me that way, especially at a child's birthday party, where such behavior was completely inappropriate. Ruth had never particularly liked Carmen, but she had always kept her opinions to herself for the sake of family harmony. This incident, however, seemed to push her past her limit of diplomatic silence. We talked for over an hour, with Ruth alternating between fury at Carmen's behavior and concern for my emotional well-being. She offered to drive down immediately to confront Carmen herself, but I convinced her that wouldn't solve anything. Still, having someone validate that what had happened was genuinely cruel and unusual helped me feel less like I was overreacting to a harmless joke. After hanging up with Ruth, I made myself a cup of tea and tried to settle into my evening routine. But every time I glanced at that gift bag, I felt the humiliation wash over me again. I finally picked it up and walked to my bedroom closet, intending to shove it on a high shelf where I wouldn't have to look at it anymore. That's when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Marcus's name, and for a moment, I debated whether to answer. I wasn't ready to pretend everything was fine, but I also wasn't ready to have a confrontation about his wife's behavior. Something in me decided to answer, perhaps hoping he was calling to apologize for what had happened. His voice sounded different when I picked up, strained and uncomfortable in a way that immediately put me on alert. He wasn't calling to chat about the party or thank me for Arya's gift. There was something heavy in his tone, something that told me this conversation was going to change everything between us. He started by asking if I was okay, if I had gotten home safely from the party. But there was something underneath his concern, something that made me suspect he knew more about the afternoon's events than he had let on. My heart started beating faster as I realized that perhaps Marcus hadn't been as oblivious to his wife's behavior as I had thought. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. He told me he needed to explain something about Carmen, something he should have told me a long time ago, but hadn't found the courage to address. The way he said it made me sink down onto my bed, still holding that awful gift bag in my other hand. What Marcus revealed to me in the next few minutes changed everything I thought I knew about my relationship with my daughter-in-law and my place in their family. It wasn't just that afternoon's humiliation that I needed to worry about. It was so much worse than I had ever imagined, and it had been going on for years without my knowledge. Marcus's voice cracked as he began to speak, and I could hear him taking deep breaths between his words. He told me that Carmen had been saying things about me for years, things that made my stomach turn as I listened. She had been telling their friends and neighbors that I was becoming senile, that I repeated myself constantly and forgot basic things. She had been painting a picture of me as a burden, someone they had to tolerate rather than a grandmother who brought joy to their lives. But it got worse, much worse. Marcus revealed that Carmen had been intercepting some of my phone calls to their house, telling people I wasn't available or that I was having one of my confused days. She had been declining invitations on my behalf to family gatherings with her side of the family, telling them I was too unwell to attend social events. I had wondered why I never heard about some of these occasions, why I felt increasingly isolated from the extended family circle. The most devastating revelation came when Marcus told me about the conversations Carmen had been having with other parents at Aria's school. She had been telling them that I was in declining health, that my time was limited, and that they were already making arrangements for when I was no longer around. She had been discussing my death as if it were an imminent certainty, not just a natural part of aging that might happen years from now. My hands started shaking so violently that I nearly dropped the phone. The broken hairbrush suddenly made perfect sense. It wasn't just a cruel joke in the moment. It was the culmination of years of Carmen systematically destroying my reputation and preparing everyone around us for my supposed imminent demise. She had been laying the groundwork for this humiliation for years, making sure that when she finally struck publicly, people would already be conditioned to see me as someone whose feelings didn't matter. Marcus's voice was thick with guilt as he continued. He admitted that he had known about some of Carmen's behavior, but had convinced himself it wasn't that serious. He had told himself that she was just stressed about managing their household and that her comments about me were just harmless venting. He had chosen to believe that her actions came from a place of concern rather than malice. But today's incident at the birthday party had opened his eyes. He had seen the look on my face when Carmen handed me that hairbrush, and he had watched how the other parents reacted. Some of his friends had approached him afterward, expressing concern about how his wife had treated me. They had asked if everything was okay at home, if there were problems in the family that they should know about. The conversation that had shaken Marcus the most came from Mrs. Patterson, whose daughter was friends with Aria. She had pulled him aside as the party was ending and told him that Carmen had been spreading rumors about my mental state for months. Mrs. Patterson had been uncomfortable with these conversations, but hadn't known how to address them directly. Today's public humiliation had finally prompted her to speak up. As Marcus talked, I felt years of confusion finally clicking into place. The strange looks I had gotten at school pickup, the way some conversations would stop when I approached groups of other parents, the gradual decrease in social invitations that I had attributed to natural changes in family dynamics. Carmen had been orchestrating my social isolation with surgical precision. I thought about all the times I had second-guessed myself, wondering if I really was becoming forgetful or repetitive. Carmen had been so subtle in her manipulations that she had made me doubt my own perceptions. She would ask me if I had already told her something, making me question whether I was repeating myself. She would claim I had forgotten conversations that I was certain had never happened. The psychological warfare had been so gradual and so carefully executed that I had begun to internalize her narrative about my declining capabilities. I had started to wonder if maybe I was becoming the burden she portrayed me as. The self-doubt had crept in so slowly that I hadn't recognized it for what it was, a deliberate campaign to undermine my confidence and social standing. Marcus told me that Carmen had even been discussing my finances with her friends, speculating about my savings and what would happen to my apartment when I was gone. She had been treating my eventual death like a business opportunity, calculating how my resources might benefit their family. The casual way she discussed my mortality with virtual strangers made me feel sick to my stomach. But perhaps the most heartbreaking revelation was that Carmen had been limiting Aria's contact with me in ways I hadn't fully realized. She had been telling my granddaughter that I was often too tired for visits, that I needed more rest than other grandmothers because of my age. She had been conditioning Aria to expect that our time together would naturally decrease as I became less capable of maintaining our relationship. I remembered several occasions when I had called to speak with Aria, only to be told she was busy with homework or activities. Now I understood that Carmen had been screening these calls, deciding when and how often I would be allowed to speak with my own granddaughter. She had been controlling the narrative of our relationship from both sides, limiting our contact while telling others that I was becoming too confused to maintain consistent relationships. The manipulation extended to gift-giving occasions as well. Marcus revealed that Carmen had been returning some of the presents I had given Aria, claiming they were inappropriate or that Aria already had similar items. She had been depriving my granddaughter of tokens of my love while simultaneously telling people that I was becoming unpredictable in my gift choices, buying things that made no sense or were unsuitable for a child. As these revelations poured out of Marcus, I felt my worldview reshaping itself around this new understanding of my daughter-in-law's character. Every interaction I had ever had with Carmen took on new meaning when viewed through the lens of her systematic campaign to diminish me. Her smiles had been calculated, her concern performative, her inclusion of me in family activities strategic rather than genuine. The birthday party incident suddenly revealed itself as the crescendo of years of careful orchestration. Carmen had spent so long convincing people that I was declining that when she finally humiliated me publicly, it seemed like confirmation of what everyone already believed. The laughter hadn't been spontaneous cruelty. It had been the predictable response to a narrative she had been crafting for years. Marcus's voice broke as he apologized for not protecting me from his wife's behavior. He admitted that he had been a coward, choosing the path of least resistance rather than confronting Carmen about her treatment of me. He had prioritized peace in his marriage over his mother's dignity, and the weight of that choice was finally crushing him. But his apologies felt hollow in the face of what I now understood. This wasn't just about one afternoon of humiliation, or even one person's cruelty. This was about years of systematic emotional abuse that had been allowed to continue because it was easier for my son to look the other way than to address his wife's behavior. I had been sacrificed on the altar of Marcus's domestic tranquility. The conversation lasted over 2 hours, with Marcus revealing detail after detail of Carmen's campaign against me. By the time we hung up, I felt like I was looking at my life through completely different eyes. The loneliness I had attributed to natural aging, The self-doubt I had thought was normal for someone my age. The gradual erosion of my social connections had all been orchestrated by someone who saw my existence as an inconvenience. I sat in my bedroom long after the phone call ended, staring at that gift bag containing the broken hairbrush. But now, it represented something different than just one moment of cruelty. It was evidence of a much larger pattern of abuse, a symbol of how Carmen viewed me and my place in their family. I was already dead to her. She was just waiting for my body to catch up with her assessment. The anger that began building in me that night was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It started as a slow burn in my chest and gradually spread through my entire body. This wasn't the hot, impulsive anger of a moment. This was cold, calculating fury that came from understanding the full scope of what had been done to me. For years, I had been the perfect victim. I had absorbed Carmen's subtle attacks without fighting back, internalized her criticisms without questioning their validity, and isolated myself without understanding why it was happening. I had been complicit in my own destruction because I hadn't recognized the war that was being waged against me. But now, I knew, and knowing changed everything. I walked to my bathroom mirror and looked at myself with new eyes. The woman staring back at me wasn't the confused, declining elderly person Carmen had been portraying. I was sharp, capable, and far from finished with life. My mind was clear, my memory intact, and my capacity for strategic thinking had been honed by decades of experience that Carmen couldn't even imagine. The realization hit me like lightning. Carmen had made a critical error in revealing her hand so publicly. By humiliating me in front of all those witnesses, she had crossed a line from subtle manipulation into overt abuse. People had seen it, remembered it, and some of them had been disturbed by it. She had given me ammunition without realizing it. I spent the rest of that night thinking, planning, and preparing for what would come next. Carmen thought she was dealing with a weak, confused old woman who would simply absorb whatever treatment she dished out. She had no idea that she had just awakened something in me that had been dormant for far too long. My son's revelations had given me a roadmap of her vulnerabilities, her methods, and her network of enablers. More importantly, they had shown me exactly how she had built her house of lies. And if I had learned anything in my 68 years on this earth, it was that houses built on lies were remarkably easy to bring down when you knew where to apply the right pressure. The broken hairbrush sat on my nightstand as I finally tried to sleep, but it no longer felt like a symbol of my humiliation. Instead, it had become something else entirely. It was my declaration of war, my reminder of exactly what kind of person I was dealing with, and my motivation for what I was about to do. Carmen had spent years convinced that she was playing chess while I was playing checkers. She was about to discover that she had gravely underestimated her opponent. The game was just beginning, and I had every intention of winning it. Every intention of winning it. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. The fog of self-doubt that had been clouding my judgment for so long had completely lifted, replaced by a sharp focus that reminded me of the woman I used to be before I allowed Carmen to chip away at my confidence. I made my coffee stronger than usual and sat at my kitchen table with a notepad, ready to document everything Marcus had told me the night before. Writing it all down made the scope of Carmen's deception even more staggering. She hadn't just been casually mean to me. She had been running a calculated campaign to isolate me from my support systems, while positioning herself as the long-suffering daughter-in-law dealing with a difficult mother-in-law. Every interaction had been planned, every cruel comment strategically delivered to achieve maximum impact. I thought about Mrs. Patterson pulling Marcus aside at the party, and I realized that Carmen had overplayed her hand. In her eagerness to publicly humiliate me, she had revealed her true nature to people who had previously only heard her carefully crafted version of events. Some of those witnesses had been uncomfortable with what they saw, which meant her facade was beginning to crack. The phone rang around 10 in the morning, and I was surprised to see Ruth's name on the caller ID. My sister rarely called 2 days in a row. But when I answered, her voice was tight with controlled anger. She had spent the night thinking about our conversation, and the more she thought about it, the angrier she became. Ruth had always been the more direct of the two of us, and she was ready to drive down and confront Carmen herself. I told her about Marcus's phone call, watching her anger transform into something colder and more calculating as I revealed the extent of Carmen's manipulation. Ruth had worked in corporate management for 30 years before retiring, and she understood workplace politics and psychological warfare better than most people. As I described Carmen's methods, I could hear Ruth's strategic mind engaging with the problem. When I finished explaining everything, Ruth was quiet for a long moment. Then, she said something that changed the entire trajectory of my thinking. She told me that Carmen's behavior wasn't just cruel, it was potentially criminal. Elder abuse laws existed specifically to protect people like me from exactly this kind of systematic mistreatment. And documenting these incidents could provide legal protection as well as social vindication. The idea hadn't occurred to me, but Ruth was right. Carmen's actions went beyond simple family drama into territory that society had decided was unacceptable. The financial speculation, the isolation tactics, the public humiliation, the manipulation of my relationship with my granddaughter. All of these behaviors formed a pattern that could be legally actionable. Ruth suggested I contact the local area agency on aging to report what had been happening. She explained that they had trained investigators who dealt with these situations regularly and could provide both immediate support and long-term protection. The thought of having official validation that Carmen's behavior was genuinely abusive, not just my oversensitive interpretation of normal family friction, felt like a lifeline. But before I made any official reports, I needed to gather evidence. Ruth's corporate experience had taught her the importance of documentation, and she walked me through the process of creating a comprehensive record of Carmen's behavior. We started with the incidents Marcus had described, but then moved on to things I could verify independently. I began by going through my phone records to identify times when I had tried to call Marcus's house, but had been told by Carmen that Marcus or Arya weren't available. I cross-referenced these with social media posts that showed they had been home during those times, creating a clear pattern of Carmen screening my calls and limiting my contact with my family. Next, I started reaching out to people who had witnessed Carmen's behavior over the years. I called Mrs. Johnson, the grandmother from the birthday party, and discovered that she had been troubled by several interactions she had witnessed between Carmen and me. She had noticed Carmen making dismissive comments about my memory and had seen her physically positioning herself between me and other family members during conversations. Mrs. Johnson revealed that she had spoken with other grandparents about Carmen's treatment of me, and several of them had expressed concern. They had noticed the pattern, but hadn't known how to address it without seeming to interfere in family business. Mrs. Johnson was relieved that I was finally acknowledging the problem and offered to provide a written statement about what she had observed. I also called my former neighbor from the old house, Mrs. Rodriguez, who had maintained a friendship with me even after I moved. She told me that Carmen had contacted her several months ago, supposedly to get my new address for a surprise gift. But during their conversation, Carmen had made several comments about my declining health and had asked probing questions about whether Mrs. Rodriguez had noticed any changes in my behavior or memory. Mrs. Rodriguez had been puzzled by the conversation at the time, especially since she spoke with me regularly and had noticed no decline in my mental faculties. Now she understood that Carmen had been fishing for information she could use to support her narrative about my supposed deterioration. Mrs. Rodriguez was appalled when she realized how her innocent responses had been twisted to serve Carmen's agenda. The most disturbing discovery came when I contacted my doctor's office to request copies of my medical records. I wanted to have official documentation that I was in good health, both physically and mentally, to counter any claims Carmen might make about my condition. But when I spoke with the receptionist, she mentioned that someone identifying herself as my daughter-in-law had called several months ago, asking about my health status. The receptionist had properly refused to provide any information due to privacy laws, but she remembered the call because the woman had been persistent and had seemed surprised that she couldn't get details about my medical condition. The timing of the call coincided with a period when Carmen had been particularly solicitous about my well-being, frequently asking if I was feeling all right and suggesting I might need to see a doctor. I realized that Carmen had been hoping to find actual medical evidence to support her claims about my declining health. When she couldn't get that ammunition from official sources, she had simply fabricated the narrative herself, counting on people's reluctance to verify her claims directly with me. It was a sophisticated form of gaslighting that relied on social dynamics and people's assumptions about aging. My investigation revealed that Carmen had been more thorough than I had initially understood. She had contacted several of my former colleagues from the school where I had worked as a librarian, supposedly to invite me to a retirement party that never actually happened. During these conversations, she had painted herself as a concerned daughter-in-law, worried about my isolation, and had subtly gathered information about my past that she could later use to support her narrative. One former colleague, Sarah Mitchell, told me that Carmen had asked detailed questions about my work performance in my final years, fishing for any signs that I might have been experiencing cognitive decline. Sarah had found the questions odd, but had answered honestly that I had been sharp and competent right up until my retirement. Carmen had seemed disappointed by this response, which now made perfect sense. The pattern was becoming clear. Carmen had been conducting a systematic intelligence operation, gathering information from multiple sources to build her case against me, while simultaneously spreading disinformation to undermine my reputation. She had been playing a long game, slowly eroding my social connections and credibility, so that when she finally moved openly against me, there would be no one left to defend me. But her thoroughness had also created vulnerabilities. By contacting so many people and asking probing questions, she had left a trail of witnesses who remembered her strange behavior. People who had been puzzled by her calls and comments were now able to see them as part of a larger pattern of manipulation. Her own evidence-gathering efforts had created evidence of her malicious intent. I spent 3 days documenting everything I could remember and verify. The picture that emerged was of a woman who had been systematically destroying my reputation and relationships for years, all while presenting herself as my devoted caregiver. Carmen had been building a narrative that would justify any treatment she chose to give me, up to and including complete isolation from my family and community. The broken hairbrush incident wasn't an isolated moment of cruelty. It was the logical conclusion of years of groundwork. The moment when Carmen felt safe enough to humiliate me publicly because she believed she had successfully convinced everyone that I deserved such treatment. She had miscalculated, but only slightly. Most of the witnesses had indeed been prepared to see me as a pathetic figure, deserving of mockery. When I finished compiling my documentation, I had a file that was over 20 pages long. It included phone records, witness statements, timelines of suspicious incidents, and copies of social media posts that contradicted Carmen's claims about my unavailability for family events. It was a comprehensive picture of psychological abuse that had been hidden behind a facade of family concern. Ruth drove down that weekend to review my evidence and help me plan my next steps. She was impressed by the thoroughness of my documentation, but also disturbed by the scope of Carmen's manipulation. As someone who had dealt with corporate malfeasance in her career, Ruth recognized the sophistication of Carmen's approach and the long-term planning it had required. We decided that my first step would be to contact the Area Agency on Aging, as Ruth had suggested. But we also discussed other options, including consulting with an elder law attorney about the possibility of pursuing legal action. Ruth felt that Carmen's behavior crossed several legal lines and that there might be grounds for both civil and criminal charges. The thought of taking legal action was daunting, but it was also empowering. For years, I had been absorbing Carmen's attacks without fighting back, accepting her treatment as something I had to endure for the sake of family harmony. Now I was considering the possibility of holding her accountable for her actions in a way that would have real consequences. But before I made any official moves, I wanted to understand more about Carmen's current situation and her vulnerabilities. Marcus's revelations had given me insight into her methods, but I needed to know more about her weaknesses. If I was going to fight back, I wanted to be strategic about it. I started by doing some research into Carmen's social media presence, looking for information about her life that she might not want exposed. What I found was revealing. Carmen presented herself online as the perfect wife and mother, someone who had sacrificed her own ambitions to care for her family. But the details of her posts didn't match up with the reality I knew. She frequently posted about expensive purchases and luxury experiences that seemed inconsistent with Marcus's income as a middle manager. Her social media suggested a lifestyle that required more money than my son could possibly be earning, which made me wonder about their actual financial situation. If they were living beyond their means, that would explain Carmen's interest in my eventual inheritance. I also noticed that Carmen's posts about me were carefully crafted to support her narrative about my declining condition. She would share photos of family gatherings with captions that mentioned my absence due to health concerns, creating a public record of my supposed deterioration. But I had copies of the actual invitations to these events, many of which I had never received. The more I studied Carmen's online presence, the more I understood how calculated her public image was. Every post was designed to reinforce specific impressions about herself, her family, and her circumstances. She was constantly performing for an audience, crafting a version of reality that served her purposes rather than reflecting the truth. This performative aspect of Carmen's personality gave me an idea for how I might expose her true nature. If Carmen was so invested in maintaining her public image as the perfect daughter-in-law dealing with a difficult mother-in-law, then publicly contradicting that narrative could be devastating for her. But I would need to be careful about how I approached it. Ruth and I spent hours discussing different strategies for responding to Carmen's behavior. We considered everything from direct confrontation to subtle social warfare to full legal action. Each approach had advantages and risks, and we wanted to choose the path that would be most effective while protecting me from further retaliation. The conversation kept coming back to the birthday party incident and the witnesses who had been uncomfortable with Carmen's behavior. These people had seen her true nature firsthand, and their discomfort suggested that her public facade was more fragile than she realized. If the right pressure were applied in the right way, her carefully constructed image could crumble quickly. I thought about Mrs. Patterson, who had felt compelled to speak to Marcus about his wife's treatment of me. She represented a type of person who valued decency and fairness, someone who would be disturbed by evidence of systematic elder abuse. If I could reach other people like her with documented proof of Carmen's behavior, I might be able to turn public opinion against her. But I also had to consider the impact on Marcus and Aria. Whatever I did to Carmen would inevitably affect my relationship with my son and granddaughter. Marcus had already shown signs of recognizing his wife's true nature, but forcing him to choose between his mother and his wife could backfire in ways that would hurt everyone, especially Aria. The complexity of the family dynamics made this situation more challenging than a simple case of workplace harassment or neighborhood conflict. I couldn't just walk away from Carmen the way I might distance myself from other toxic people. She was embedded in my family structure in a way that made any response to her behavior complicated and potentially costly. As Ruth and I talked through these challenges, I began to understand that whatever action I took needed to be carefully calibrated to achieve specific goals. I wanted Carmen to face consequences for her behavior, but I also wanted to preserve my relationship with Marcus and Aria if possible. I wanted to protect myself from further abuse, but I didn't want to destroy my family in the process. The broken hairbrush still sat on my nightstand, a daily reminder of the humiliation Carmen had subjected me to, and the years of manipulation that had led up to that moment. But now it represented something different. It was evidence of Carmen's cruelty, proof that her mask had finally slipped in front of witnesses. It was the mistake that would allow me to fight back. I realized that Carmen's greatest strength, her ability to manipulate social situations and control narratives, was also her greatest vulnerability. She had built her entire strategy around maintaining a carefully crafted public image. If that image were destroyed, she would lose the social support system that had enabled her abuse of me. The question was no longer whether I would fight back, but how I would do it. Carmen had spent years systematically destroying my reputation and relationships, thinking she was dealing with a helpless victim who would never find the strength to resist. She was about to learn just how wrong she had been about that. By the time Ruth left that Sunday evening, I had developed a plan that felt both measured and powerful. I wouldn't strike immediately like an angry woman lashing out in pain. Instead, I would move with the calculated precision of someone who had finally understood the game being played against her. Carmen thought she held all the cards, but she had made the critical error of underestimating her opponent. My first move was subtle, but strategic. I began reaching out to people in Carmen's social circle, not to complain about her treatment of me, but to express concern about her well-being. I called some of the mothers from Aria's school, women who had witnessed the birthday party incident, and mentioned how worried I was about Carmen's stress levels affecting her judgment. When Mrs. Patterson answered my call, I could hear the surprise in her voice. She clearly hadn't expected me to reach out after what had happened at the party. I kept my tone gentle and concerned, explaining that I was worried about Carmen because her behavior at the birthday party seemed so unlike her usual self. I wondered aloud if she might be dealing with some personal struggles that were causing her to act out. The brilliance of this approach was that it forced people to reconsider what they had witnessed. Instead of seeing Carmen as someone making a harmless joke at my expense, they began to view her actions as potentially problematic behavior that needed explanation. Mrs. Patterson admitted that she had been troubled by the incident and had wondered if everything was all right in Marcus and Carmen's marriage. I shared similar conversations with 3 other mothers who had been at the party. Each time, I positioned myself as the concerned elder who was worried about a family member's troubling behavior, rather than the victim of that behavior. This reframing was powerful because it put Carmen's actions in a different context, while establishing me as the rational, caring family member. Within a week, I started hearing through my network that people were asking questions about Carmen's home life. The narrative she had carefully constructed about being the devoted daughter-in-law dealing with a difficult mother-in-law was beginning to crack as people wondered what kind of stress might cause someone to publicly humiliate an elderly family member. My second strategy involved documenting everything going forward with meticulous precision. I purchased a small recording device and began keeping detailed logs of every interaction with Carmen or anyone in her circle. I photographed the broken hairbrush from multiple angles and stored copies of all my research in multiple locations. If Carmen tried to escalate her campaign against me, I would be ready with evidence. But the most important part of my plan involved rebuilding the social connections that Carmen had systematically destroyed. I began accepting invitations I had previously declined, reaching out to old friends I had lost touch with, and generally becoming more visible in my community. Carmen's strategy had relied on my isolation, so breaking that isolation would undermine her entire approach. I joined a book club at the local library, started attending senior fitness classes at the community center, and volunteered at the food bank, where several of my former teaching colleagues also donated their time. Each new connection was someone who could witness my mental sharpness and emotional stability, providing a counter-narrative to Carmen's claims about my declining condition. The change in my social life was remarkable. Within 3 weeks, my calendar was fuller than it had been in years. People were genuinely pleased to reconnect with me, and many commented on how vibrant and engaged I seemed. Several mentioned that they had been concerned about me because they hadn't seen me around as much lately, confirming that Carmen's isolation tactics had been noticed by others. During this time, I also began subtly gathering information about Carmen's vulnerabilities. Through casual conversations with Marcus, I learned more about their financial situation, their marriage dynamics, and Carmen's relationships with her own family. The picture that emerged was of a woman who was far less secure than her public persona suggested. Marcus mentioned during one of our phone calls that Carmen had been stressed about money lately, worrying about Aria's education costs and their mortgage payments. This information aligned with my observations about her expensive social media posts and suggested that their financial situation might be more precarious than it appeared. A woman living beyond her means might be particularly invested in securing access to a mother-in-law's eventual inheritance. I also learned that Carmen's relationship with her own mother was strained. Marcus casually mentioned that Carmen rarely spoke to her parents and had declined several invitations to family gatherings on her side. This pattern suggested that Carmen might have a history of difficult family relationships, making her treatment of me part of a larger pattern rather than an isolated incident. The most valuable intelligence came when Marcus mentioned that Carmen had been having conflicts with some of her closest friends. Apparently, there had been some kind of falling out with her best friend from college over something Carmen had said about the friend's parenting choices. Marcus didn't have details, but the fact that Carmen was losing friends suggested that her manipulative tendencies weren't limited to her treatment of me. Armed with this information, I began to understand that Carmen's carefully constructed social image was more fragile than I had initially realized. She wasn't just cruel to me because of some personal animosity. She was someone who used manipulation and social warfare as standard tools for managing relationships, which meant she likely had other victims and other vulnerabilities. My investigation into Carmen's background revealed additional concerning patterns. I discovered through mutual connections that she had left her previous job under mysterious circumstances, with some colleagues suggesting there had been conflicts with supervisors. Her employment history showed a pattern of short-term positions, which could indicate either ambition or an inability to maintain professional relationships. More significantly, I learned that Carmen had been making inquiries about my financial situation that went beyond normal family concern. She had contacted my bank, claiming to be worried about potential financial exploitation of an elderly relative. The bank had properly refused to provide any information, but they had documented the call. Carmen had been fishing for details about my assets while simultaneously portraying me as mentally incompetent. This discovery was particularly damaging because it showed premeditation. Carmen hadn't just been casually cruel or thoughtlessly dismissive. She had been actively investigating my finances while building a narrative that would justify her eventual control over my resources. The birthday party humiliation was part of a larger campaign designed to position her as my inevitable caretaker and heir. I shared this information with Ruth during one of our weekly phone calls, and her reaction was immediate and fierce. As someone with experience in corporate investigations, Ruth recognized the sophistication of Carmen's approach and the serious legal implications of her behavior. She strongly encouraged me to contact law enforcement and pursue criminal charges for elder abuse and financial exploitation. But I wasn't ready for that level of escalation yet. I wanted to give Carmen an opportunity to face social consequences for her behavior before involving the legal system. My plan was to systematically dismantle the reputation she had spent years building, exposing her true nature to the community that had enabled her treatment of me. The opportunity I had been waiting for came when I learned that Carmen was organizing a charity fundraiser for Aria's school. She was positioning herself as the dedicated parent volunteer, taking on a leadership role that would showcase her community involvement and organizational skills. The event was scheduled for 6 weeks away, giving me time to prepare my own participation. I contacted the school's volunteer coordinator and offered to help with the fundraiser. Given my background as an educator and my previous involvement in school activities, my offer was enthusiastically accepted. The coordinator mentioned that they needed someone with experience managing large events, and my qualifications made me an ideal addition to the planning committee. Carmen's reaction when she learned I would be working on the fundraiser was exactly what I had hoped for. Marcus told me that she had been surprised and not entirely pleased by my involvement, though she couldn't object publicly without seeming petty. She was trapped by her own public persona as the caring daughter-in-law who welcomed family involvement. Working on the fundraiser committee gave me an inside view of Carmen's leadership style and interpersonal skills. What I observed confirmed many of my suspicions about her character. She was charming and effective when things went her way, but she became manipulative and divisive when faced with disagreement or challenges to her authority. During our second committee meeting, I watched Carmen undermine another volunteer who had suggested a different approach to the silent auction. Carmen didn't disagree directly. Instead, she made subtle comments that questioned the volunteer's experience and judgment, gradually isolating her from the group consensus. It was a masterful display of social manipulation that reminded me exactly of how she had treated me over the years. But Carmen had made a crucial error. She had assumed that I was still the confused, isolated woman she had been systematically destroying. She treated me with the same dismissive courtesy she had always shown, not realizing that I was now documenting every interaction and building a case study of her behavior patterns. I began sharing my observations with other committee members in carefully casual conversations. I didn't criticize Carmen directly, but I asked thoughtful questions about group dynamics and decision-making processes that encouraged others to reflect on what they had witnessed. Slowly, people began to notice patterns they had previously overlooked. The breakthrough came during our fourth meeting, when Carmen made the mistake of treating me dismissively in front of the entire committee. We were discussing venue options, and I suggested a location that would save the school nearly $1,000 in rental fees. Carmen immediately dismissed the idea, claiming that the venue wasn't suitable for the kind of event we were planning. But I had done my research. I presented detailed information about the venue's facilities, capacity, and successful events they had hosted previously. My presentation was thorough, professional, and clearly demonstrated that Carmen had rejected a superior option without proper consideration. The other committee members were impressed by my preparation and began asking pointed questions about Carmen's alternative suggestions. Carmen's response was to become defensive and slightly hostile, suggesting that perhaps I didn't understand the complexity of modern fundraising events. She made several comments about generational differences and changing standards that were clearly intended to undermine my credibility based on my age. But instead of seeming wise and experienced, she came across as condescending and dismissive. The committee members' reactions told me everything I needed to know. Several people looked uncomfortable with Carmen's tone, and 2 members actively supported my venue suggestion. Carmen found herself in the unfamiliar position of having her judgment questioned by people who had previously deferred to her leadership. Her carefully constructed authority was beginning to crumble. After the meeting, 3 different committee members approached me privately to express support for my ideas and concern about Carmen's leadership style. They had begun to see her behavior as problematic rather than authoritative, exactly the shift in perception I had been working to achieve. Carmen's own actions were destroying the reputation I had spent weeks preparing to attack. That broken hairbrush still sits on my dresser today, but it no longer represents my humiliation. It reminds me that sometimes the cruelest people give us exactly what we need to find our strength. Carmen thought she was breaking down a weak-old woman, but she awakened a force she never saw coming. When someone shows you who they really are, believe them the first time, and then show them exactly who you are in return.